People love easy answers, but there's no simple answer or one reason for the breakup of the Beatles. The Beatles were four very strong men, and it took a hell of a lot to take this band out. And we're going to explore the multiple reasons for the demise of the Beatles here on Pop Goes the 60s. There's a tendency to give this topic a tidy ending like we saw in the anthology, but it wasn't tidy and it's very complex. And this is not an attempt to give the one answer because there isn't one answer. This is an attempt to talk about the series of events that led up to the breakup so we can weigh them and discuss them. This will be a three-part series laying out the multiple reasons the band broke up, and after which I'm going to have a survey so you can weigh in and together we can collectively rank and talk about all the reasons that they broke up. And after I've collected enough data, I can report all those results back to you. I think it's safe to say that the breakup of the band came as a surprise to most fans, and I don't think anybody was happy about it. Nobody wanted the band to break up, and one of the benefits for me personally of growing up in the generation just after the Beatles is I missed out on all that breakup stuff. In fact, in the mid-70s, I remember asking around, because I was getting to the Beatles at that point, I said, did the Beatles break up? And nobody could give me a straight answer if they were broke up or not, which I thought was kind of interesting. The first reason I'm going to offer is the end of touring. When they stopped touring in 1966, that came after a very tough couple of tours for them. And I'm surprised they lasted as long as they did. And at the end of that, George Harrison had an interesting quote where he said, "I'm not a Beatle anymore." So I think even he was associating a working band as a touring and playing live band. And it was maybe unknown as to what they were going to be doing in the future. And all those days of the camaraderie and the shared rooms and hiding their rooms from the fans and all the meals together and traveling, all that kind of came to a halt. 1966 was probably the year that really made them hate touring. And we all know the problems of that year, the Jesus Christ comments and the tour of Manila. They thought people were shooting at them when there was explosions near the stage, and they'd have to look around at each other to see if everybody was still standing. And instead of this us against them mentality, they were able to kind of vacation on their own and spend some time close to the end of the year doing their own thing, which they hadn't done in a long time, so they probably really needed it. But I think this disconnect from Beatlemania was the first step where they were starting to get a little disconnected from their fans. So in 1970, Ringo Starr had an interesting quote talking about the ending of the touring years. This is what he said. "It's obvious that we have distanced ourselves from each other to a certain extent, but the conditions were different then. We were constantly on the road, so that must have been one of the reasons that we were constantly together. We were mostly unmarried. We didn't have families. We didn't have wives. We didn't have children. In that respect, we were freer, yet on the other hand, we were more restrained, more attached to each other. Because of that, we were constantly physically together. In the same hotel, on the same planes, under siege. There's none of that today." So that was in 1970. I don't know how they could have continued touring under those circumstances where they couldn't really hear themselves. They weren't bothering really rehearsing. They didn't sound good. That last tour weren't sellouts across the board. There was empty seats. The year before was probably the novelty of the stadium show was new then. And all this sort of taken its toll on them, I think, personally and collectively. And I think when you're not playing together as a band, maybe even on stage for an audience, maybe you lose a little closeness. And I think I've heard musicians say that, and I think that happened to the Beatles to some degree. I had mentioned that the fact that they stopped touring, that they started to lose touch with their audience. And I think by 1967, they really started to lose touch when they started looking to buy that Greek island. I mean, that was, crazy talk. I mean, they were going to live communally on this island. Here's John's quote. He said, "We're all going to live there, perhaps forever, just coming home for visits. Or it might be 6 months a year. It'll be fantastic, all on our own island." So that didn't happen, and I can't see how it would have worked. They talked about having a school for their kids and everything on this island, but I think that was a result of trying to get away from the fans and the craziness. And once you do that, I think that you're just stuck with one another, you know. So the following year in '68, in lieu of touring, they went to India together. So that was like a long vacation, not exactly a tour, but you could see when they traveled together, they were going to the most remote places possible to escape fans. So the second reason is the loss or death of Brian Epstein, their manager. And a lot of people look to this point as the beginning of the end. Certainly John Lennon did. And one of the things about Brian Epstein was that he handled all the business. He knew how the business was run. Had he lived, the Project Apple probably would have happened a very different way. The Beatles didn't really have to worry about that stuff. They had to just worry about the music. And once Epstein died, the Beatles had to start to worry. The other thing is that with regard to the Beatles publishing, Dick James owned a part of the publishing jointly with Epstein and the Beatles, namely Lennon and McCartney. And Brian Epstein was always kind of a middleman between the business world and the Beatles. And I think he took a lot of blows for them, or softened things a lot, or made it easy for them. Because once he was gone, the Beatles themselves didn't handle business proceedings very well, or very professionally at times. So all these contracts that had been signed, some of them were very convoluted. Brian Epstein knew about them. And when he was gone, it was a mess. They didn't know where they stood with anything, really. Weren't sure what exactly they owned, didn't know where the money was. You had American companies that did some of the merchandising. So it was a lot to deal with. Brian Epstein, since he handled all the touring, he was one of the guys that was always very insistent that they do something for the fans. The touring part of it made Brian have the connection with the fans and insisted that the Beatles continue that. And obviously they said no. So Brian, I think this would have allowed him to manage in a different way, because in 1966, 67, this is when rock music really started to change. And if ever you needed needed management, this was the time. And the Beatles went without a manager for 2 years and arrogantly thought they could manage themselves in these times, which is kind of crazy when you look back on it. And it's amazing they didn't unravel sooner without a manager. Another thing that Brian may have been able to provide in later years, we see, and I'll talk about this in a little bit here, but some of the dynamics within the band, as they changed a bit and people grew and more success came. Brian Epstein might have been the guy to quell some of those insufficiencies in the band, or some of the lopsidedness. One of the things about touring was that the two guys in the band that weren't writing, Ringo and George, that afforded them equal shares of the take, of the gate, when they did tour. So that was a way for those two guys to feel equal when, if you looked at just the songwriting royalties, which nobody really could have predicted, there was a huge disparity there, and a huge disparity of money as well. Reason number 3, Paul McCartney. Now, Paul actually did file suit to dissolve the membership of the Beatles, but before I get into that, there was also some other issues that Paul admits to, and he has always been labeled by some of his band members as being difficult in the studio. And this thing that every two-bit writer in the world has called bossiness. Now, Paul McCartney has admitted to being overbearing in the studio, particularly with George and Ringo. And I think the reason Ringo left in '68, if you listen to the anthology, Ringo says, well, I was playing like shit and I was feeling unloved, blah, blah, blah. But Paul McCartney, I think that this had more to do with Paul's overbearingness with Ringo's drumming. We saw what happened in the Get Back, Let It Be movie. You know, Paul and George had a little bit of an argument. And there were a couple other instances during those recordings where Paul, I think, was overstepping his bounds. An example of that, I don't know if this was in Peter Jackson's film, but it's certainly on the Niagara Reels. There's this part where George is playing, and Paul asks him not to play that chord. And George says, well, why? He says, that's passé. And George says, well, it's just a chord. You know, and as Paul says it's passé, you can hear that he knows he's overstepping his bounds, but he says it anyway. And I'm thinking, don't say it, he's going to leave, you know. So Paul's social skills in the studio, I think, made for some of the work in the studio difficult. and John Lennon had mentioned it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with band dynamics. But the other thing Paul did was when he released his solo album in 1970, some of the early copies that went to the press had that questionnaire in it that made it look like the Beatles were over, though he never said he quit the Beatles. However, that's how the press played it. And again, Paul McCartney's PR, one of the worst PR guy in pop music. I'm going to do a video on that, by the way. John Lennon was completely wrong. People bought that hook, line, and sinker, but McCartney was a terrible PR guy. And he got the blame for the Beatles breakup, even though he was the one trying to keep it together the longest. What was interesting, in November of '69, there was a quote from Paul McCartney said, "The Beatle thing is over." And that didn't get picked up by anybody. Nobody paid any attention to that. And it wasn't, Lennon had left the band or said he wanted divorce in late September of '69. So 5-6 months goes by and everybody's kind of, well, what's going on? What's going on? And it looked like something might happen, but John and Paul weren't talking during that time, and Paul eventually just released his own solo album. And did so in a very strange way. He could have just released the album with nothing else said, but he didn't. So in the end, he ended up suing the Beatles to dissolve the partnership. This was on the very last day of 1970. And Paul, I think, would have preferred to sue Alan Klein to get out of the Beatles, but he couldn't do it that way. He had to dissolve the partnership. So that is quite literally breaking up the Beatles, but was he the reason? Well, I think there's other reasons as well. All right, reason number 4, we have bad business dealings. And this does link directly to Brian Epstein and his absence. And the Beatles, I still can't believe that they had, they were full of themselves. They thought they could manage themselves. And there was a manager that they could have hired, that was Robert Stigwood. And Stigwood was coming up, he started RSO Records, and he was representing Cream and the Bee Gees. But Stigwood had kind of stiffed the Beatles earlier on in their career. And the Beatles are the best grudge holders there are. So Stigwood didn't have a chance, but he could have been the guy and may have been a good choice, at least at that time, to do something temporarily, at least to sort through some of the business things that they had going at that time that were very convoluted. The first thing that they did after Epstein's death, as we know, was the Magical Mystery Tour project. This again shows their hubris and their insistence at doing everything themselves, as if anything they would do would just magically turn out wonderful. Well, when it comes to switching mediums, they always struggle. I mean, they're great at music. In fact, the Magical Mystery Tour album, great. But the film that went with it, not so great. Maybe they should have hired a screenwriter, maybe a director, maybe a director of photography. They could have hired a lot of people to help it make it look more professional, but they thought otherwise, and they paid a price for it. Unfortunately, it was shown in black and white, and it was shown on television, and what really was an underground film and should have stayed underground, they passed it off as an above-ground product, and it did not go over well. This was their first failure, and I think this has to do with not having a manager or somebody to tell them that, hey, this isn't good enough. Ultimately, the film Magical Mystery Tour was their attempt to combine psychedelic surrealism with like an acid trip for a mass audience. But all it really did was start their disconnect with the public. Now, one thing they did after that, just a number of months after that failure, was to start Apple, the company Apple, which initially was a tax dodge, and they needed to hide their money from the tax man because they were being taxed out of their minds. This had been in the works for about a year anyway, but the way that they portrayed it was what they called some kind of Western communism, electronics, manufacturing, which John Lennon didn't even know really what they were doing with that, clothing boutiques, all this stuff that really had nothing to do with music. And as I said, this was a tax shelter, and that's all it really was. And they solicited all these people to work for them. They had all their friends working for them, and people could send in bits of film and original music, none of which got looked at. And about the only thing that worked was the recording side of it, was the music side, their new label, and that went fairly well. But generally, they had all their friends living off of them. And Apple became this like, if you can imagine an office building that was just, drugs were part of the budget. And I would love to see the alcohol bill of Derek Taylor. I mean, high-end alcohol, that's all these people were doing, was one big party. And how they thought they could make this work, I have no idea. But this is just how out of it, or how big-headed and arrogant they were, and thought they could just do this and somehow make magic out of it. The other thing at this time that was going on was, without Brian Epstein, they were no longer quite the businessmen they thought. I mean, their copyrights and their publishing was at stake here. When Brian Epstein died, much of his belongings went to his brother, and he owned a big share of the Beatles publishing, and that went to his brother Clive. And so this started to unravel, and this is how the Beatles started to lose their publishing. Once the Beatles went public with their publishing, they were in jeopardy of losing them more so. And Dick James was a guy that they had to deal with. And they started not dealing with him very professionally. One of the things they did was, and again, Brian Epstein was the guy, the kind of the go-between. He could deal with the Dick James type of characters. And James had, there was a meeting with the Beatles, and Dick James was there, and it got a little bit ugly, and the Beatles filmed it. And they ended up showing it publicly. Not very professional. So James is like, what am I doing? What am I dealing with these guys for? They're not helping me out at all here. They're not even being good business partners. So this was a time when the Beatles, and particularly Lennon and McCartney, should have been playing nice with Dick James, because there was a lot at stake, and they couldn't do it, and they ended up losing their publishing because James sold. Now, they didn't even have a clause in there saying that they had the first right of refusal. That's another oversight. So that might have gone back to the Epstein days, but had Epstein been there, there's no way that they wouldn't have been given the first right of refusal, because that's the relationship Epstein had with Dick James. So the retainment of the publishing should have been a top priority, and Paul was quoted as saying at one point, saying, "I think it was the money. Whereas it's wrecked many marriages, I suppose it wrecked this one as well." So losing the publishing was really a sour pill, tough pill to swallow for Lennon and McCartney. But they really have nobody to blame but themselves. They handled it poorly. As bad as business people as they were, they did not handle it with much dignity. And James was a guy they could have worked with, and it just went south because they were not up to the challenge of dealing like businessmen. They were musicians. And that's the problem without having a manager to speak for you and to say the right things, and not to show up the guy that you're trying to gain your publishing rights from, So anyway, those are the first four. I'm going to end the video here. In part 2, we're going to pick up with a few more reasons. And at the end of part 3, I'm going to offer a link for you to take a survey to help weigh the importance of each of these reasons, so you can decide what you think was the most important reason for the breakup, and add a reason of your own if you think I missed one. So we're going to do that after part 3. So stay tuned for part 2 right here on Pop Goes the 60s. Here come the sun.